Coming to you live from the depths of Kitchener, Ontario. Hope you're doing well. This is part 3 of the never-ending presentation on chapter 3. I promise there won't be a part 4. I promise I'll try to keep this quick, but this is a kind of cool final part, and then I'll kind of prepare you for the quiz that I'll get up tomorrow. All right, let's jump into it. Hope you're doing well, and yeah, without further ado. The older I get, the more I get blown away by this concept of like the brain has these sense organs that it uses to make sense of the world outside and to bring in information from the outside world, right? And we call these like the taste buds, and then our eyes and our ears, and our sense of touch and our sense of smell. And this is what we call our sensory, or a sensation, or our sense organs. And it's what senses things outside. But then you don't just see things, you see things and decide if they're important to you or valuable or not. Or like when you're driving, you're seeing all kinds of stuff and not really paying attention to it, but if something comes in front of you, you pay attention to it. You're constantly applying judgment to what you're seeing. Right? And that's where perception comes in, this like interpretation of the senses. Like, is the sound that you're hearing noise or is it music, is largely a perception thing. But the noise itself is, or the sound itself is a sensation that your ears are being exposed to. Right? So this is kind of like the main point I want to make, is just like when information interacts with your sensories, right? So now think about this. A newborn's vision is estimated at about 2,600. So that means that a baby from 20 feet could see what somebody with perfect adult sight could see from 600 feet. And then, like, by the time the baby's born, what you're going to see in a second is that they're at basically 20/20. So visual perception is highly prioritized at every level of development, or not at every level of development, but at this level of newborn development, right? So just, I want you to keep thinking about this idea that it's a dual process. It's basically like sensation is the video recorder and perception is like, but see, that almost makes this fake idea that like you see things and then you think about it, because the reality is it's happening like splits of seconds after. What I'm doing with my hands is this idea of like, this is sensation, this is perception. It's not like you see things and then you like think about, do I think this person's attractive? It's like, no, you had that thought like immediately. Yeah, so this picture's just kind of cool. I thought that like you can kind of see how as the kid's getting closer to the ear, this is just like a picture of, I guess, like his mom or whatever, but that the face is getting more acute, like the, not acute, but the acuity, or like the pixelation, the how clean the image is getting cleaner and cleaner, right? So by the time the baby's like half a year, it's like basically 20/40, and then by the time the baby's a full year old, it's basically adult, right? And you've maybe heard me say this already in this course, because I say this all the time, but that like a baby's or a kid's hearing is not adult level until they're 6. So the fact that their vision is adult level at 1 is actually pretty interesting, and it shows how much it's prioritized. Okay, I do actually want to read this to you. So in this seminal study, so just a seminal study, or like this like often cited study, someone named Gibson, Eleanor Gibson and Richard Walk, this was in 1960, just reading this note to you, created this visual cliff idea, right? So it's the baby's on top of that thing, and it's like the checkerboard, and it looks like it's a cliff. That's why it's called a visual cliff. It like looks like a cliff. Like it looks like you're an adult and you can see that it's obviously they're not going to like let the kid just get hurt. that's like some kind of plexiglass covering, but it's supposed to look to the baby like they can see down, right? And so the idea is if the baby goes to crawl out and looks down and then doesn't, well, that sort of gives you the idea that the baby can see that it would fall, right? And to be able to tell that you would fall, you need to have depth perception. Okay, so in this visual cliff, they did this experiment by creating two levels of a checkerboard pattern, one at the height of the table and one at the floor level. The drop-off was covered by glass so that the baby was safe to crawl over the visual cliff. They placed 6 to 12-month-olds at the edge of the visual cliff and had their mothers coax them, like, come on, come here. Most of the infants wouldn't crawl in the glass. It seems like it's interesting. It's like there seems to be this connection, and it makes complete sense evolutionarily, and it's an incredible benefit that it's like this. That as soon as you start to crawl, basically, you become good at depth perception. That movement and depth perception go together. Gotta think of how like, and that's something that's not like uniquely human at all, right? All kinds of species and forms of life have depth perception. It's an important thing, right? You have to know when your world all of a sudden doesn't exist until lower down. Yeah, like, again, I won't make COVID points, but like a child basically looks at your eyes and your mouth. 90% of communication's not verbal, right? Nonverbal. That's at least what they always used to say when I was growing up. A child, if you go into a delivery room, even right after birth, the child's not looking at the mom's, or the child's not looking at anybody's shoulder or elbow. They're looking at faces though. And they're looking at the eyes and the sides of the mouth mainly. Right, within hours after birth, infants prefer to look at a face rather than just a random thing, and they're actually preferring to look at ones that are symmetrically attractive. Right, and they spend more, and this is like because you can have cameras that are like tracking where their eyes are looking at. You can see that they if you show them a picture of like a human or like a beautiful woman or whatever, and then another beautiful woman, and one's upside down, they'll look at the one that's the right direction more. They'll look at a human more than a monkey. They'll look at someone that looks more similar to them than someone that looks less similar to them. So it's like they're showing visual preference basically as soon as they're born. As soon as there's visual preference, which is just another way of saying as soon as there's sensation, there's perception. And it's like hearing in the baby doesn't come the same speed, right? And I kind of made this point before. It's like that's and I don't know why I've seen that picture a million times, but it's just a kind of cute picture. Little baby jamming out to tunes. Um, yeah, within the last 2 months of pregnancy, the baby's starting to hear. Well, it's like mom. It really comes down to. So you can think of it like mom's heartbeat's going to be pretty loud inside the body, and so is some of mom's other internal processes. And like the thing that's interesting is that. So really, it comes down to at what point does the baby's um kind of if you want to think of it as like their auditory system have the ability to process sound, because mom's basically and the outside world's basically making a relatively consistent amount of sound the whole time, and by like month 7 or so, and even maybe a little bit, maybe a little bit to quite a bit before, right? Because it's tough because it's almost like two questions. It's almost like sound outside the body and sound within the womb. But then again, there's this like developing sensation perception difference. So say the baby hears something and turns towards it, but that's almost more of a reaction than a. Whereas by like month 7, 8, maybe the baby's starting to hear a familiarness with mom. That's almost something that we would consider like an early perception. So it's just kind of interesting to use that language to try to break down what the actual dream-like experience of the newborn baby is like, because it's nothing like adult cognition. Immediately after birth, an infant can't hear soft sounds as well. So it's like, now think about this for a sec. This is kind of interesting from like a development or evolutionary perspective of like why the baby would be born able to basically hear like shocking, like I didn't do it because it'd be annoying with the audio, but like a shocking loud slap. It's like, well, those are more likely dangerous noises, like its ability to distinguish between different sounding noises. And one thing babies and little kids aren't as good at is like telling the direction of the noise. Like as an adult, you're pretty decent at telling, like, did it come from like behind you to the left, or behind you from the center left, or behind you from the middle, or the right center, or the far right. It's like, I forget what the word for that is, but like it's basically just like directional audio. And a baby's not as good at that until they're like almost 6. But then if you think about it, it's like, all right, well, if you could pick your skills that you got good at first, you would definitely say, give me the good vision first, and give me the directional audio whenever you kind of get to it. All right. I've always liked this concept. It's pretty cool. And the way I like to describe this is like, think about like maybe your grandma or maybe somebody in your family makes a really nice dessert that you like. A nice piece of pie or a nice like square or nice Danish or something. And it's like when you picture it in your head, you're some of what you're picturing might be a picture, and then some of what you're picturing might be a smell of the pie, and some of it's the taste for sure, and some of it might even be like the crispiness of the crust and what that taste feels like, and then some of it might be like the sound of your grandma's voice and sitting at the table there, and like, so there's more like visual and even tactile aspects. And so the idea is that it's not like, if we were to see your brain, we'd see all those areas lighting up. We wouldn't see like, oh, you have like a taste memory and like a vision memory, and those parts of the brain would be firing because your brain's basically recreating that moment. Yeah, memory's so wild. It's basically like a time traveling simulation where your brain recreates the well, to use the words from before, almost like the activated connectome of the brain from earlier. There's not like a file. So the idea is your memory is actually encoded all over your brain intermodally. It's like if you kind of can just get past the language a bit, it's like the study of the mind's like endlessly fascinating. Okay, I just was like, oh, don't get too worried about the words. Here's another example of this. So Piaget says that this is a Piaget idea that you basically have a model of the world in your head, and he's going to call this a cognitive schema. A scheme is like, think about like an old movie where like they're like robbing a bank and they have like a scheme for how to rob the bank. They have like a plan. It's like you basically have all these plans in your head about how you're going to live your life. And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And when they don't, you're kind of forced into this process of trying to, well, I'm jumping ahead, but the bottom word, accommodate, right? So it's like his idea is that you have this plan in your head and you go out into the world and you try out your game plan, sort of. And that's what he calls a simulation. And the kid uses their existing schema to try to deal with their world. And then sometimes it's going to work, right? Sometimes you're going to go and ask the kid to play the way that you've been taught to ask kids how to play, and it's going to go well. And the schema or your plan or whatever worked. And sometimes it's not going to go well and they're going to be mean to you or something, and you're going to realize, well, maybe next time I'll do this in a little bit different way and accommodate. And his idea is that this is like how the child's mind's learning. The child's mind's learning from this, like, not just from learning like, oh, this thing's associated with this thing in like a kind of operant or classical conditioning sense, but like the child's learning by getting a more and more complex model of the world that's more and more functionally accurate, right? What I mean by that is it's more and more adaptive, or which is just another way of saying, okay, so if you have a way of thinking about things and a way of understanding people and how you relate to people, and every time you try to do something, it's like you're running into a wall. It's like nothing's working. It's like, okay, well, maybe the map's wrong. Maybe we need to work on that map. And the old saying of like back to the drawing board, it's like that's what Piaget sort of meant with accommodation, adjusting the schema to account for, people don't like when you do that, or people, whatever. So he thought that this would adaptation of sort of, think about this word of like, it's kind of interesting to think of what development, what evolution, and what adaptation mean. So development means how you go from baby to old age. Evolution means a bunch of those developments in a row, or how things evolve as a species. Adaptation means how well you kind of deal with your situation and succeed and thrive. Right? It's like try to describe the word adaptation without using the word adapt. Right? It's how you adapt to your environment. Everybody knows what that word means. But how do you adapt to your environment? You try your plan, and when it doesn't work, you adjust your plan, and hopefully your plan's getting stronger and stronger and stronger and more functional. And by functional, meaning it's working, right? Because if it's dysfunctional, that means it's not working. So, and then it sort of kind of makes sense then when you think about this word that, I've taught this class a ton of times. I've taught it like whatever 4 times at Nipsing, but I've taught developmental psych like probably 30 times at Conestoga, because I do it like 3 times a year. And it's like every time I bring up this topic of sensory motor, I'm almost like more impressed with it every time I get back to it, because his idea here is really spellbinding in a way that like the baby's mind's developing through a series of its senses and its movement, sensory motor, and that those things, it's just not the same as like how we're thinking now. They're in this like almost dreamlike early stage where they're so in the moment. They're so in the moment that they're basically their movement and their sensation, sensory motor. And they're constructing an understanding of the world by coordinating this sensory experience and this physical movement. Again, just think of motor as like your motor skills or your ability to move. According to Piaget, a crowning achievement of this stage is object permanence. So, object permanence basically just means this idea of like the peekaboo effect, right? That like if I go like this and I come away, it's like at a certain point the baby laughs, because it seems like I'm coming in and out of existence, and that you might be like, well, that's wild. It's like they think you're coming in and out of the universe. It's like, well, it's not like they understand what existence means or what that would mean. To them, you're just there and then not there, and they don't have a deep enough cognitive skill set yet to like have the kind of conception that we would have, that obviously like when Mike's not talking to us, he has his whole other life that he's living, and people are coming. It's like the child's just kind of responding to what's right there. And it's not until they're almost like 9 months that they start to realize that like things have more stability. You know, objects are permanent is the idea, right? The understanding that things exist even if they can't be seen or heard or touched. That like you guys aren't wondering if like that the globe in the background is like still gonna be here on the days that you're not talking to me. Like unless I moved it or something. Objects are permanent. Right, it's why peekaboo stops working at a certain. That's the point I was going to make. Is that so? It's like peekaboo. It's like coming in and out of existence. Sorry, got a little glitchy there at the end of that last slide. Um. Okay, so this is just saying like, okay, well, the baby's brain's building in this incredibly dynamic stage, right? And some of it's that as the baby's learning, like some things are rewarding, and some things the rewarding is like mom's attention or somebody like. And so there's an aspect of the baby why it's doing what it's doing is because of the attention mom's getting it, and it's starting to pay more attention to the things that are more consistent. And I like that definition, right? It's like attention is actually very specifically kind of like aiming your mental resources, that the baby's focusing the mental resources on specific things. And as the baby's getting better able to not just see everything as kind of random in and out, but to pay attention to stuff, literally, that's linked with cognitive development as it is at all stages, right? Like I can't teach you anything if you're not paying attention. And what's joint attention? It's like, well, it's helpful if you're paying attention to the same thing I'm talking about, right? Like, obviously, 'cause it's like you might be like, well, I am paying attention to this book I'm reading over here. It's like, well, if you're paying attention to a book over here and I'm talking about this here, then you're paying attention, but you're not paying joint attention. That's basically what that means, right? That like, um, how good a kid is at being able to like follow along when you're reading to them and stuff is actually decently predictive of cognitive functioning later. And again, that shouldn't be surprising because somebody that has a slightly lower IQ than someone else, but that has more disciplined attention, will outperform the other person all the time. So the idea here is that joint attention is super important. This is the next day. Sorry, this is the never-ending PowerPoint. I promise I'll get it to you tonight. It's now 9:30 on Tuesday. Joint attention in infancy requires three things, right? So the baby needs to be able to tell what you're looking at, basically, right? Like be able to track your gaze, be able to um, know that you're looking at what I'm looking at because I'm wanting you to, or because you're wanting me to. It's like the idea of like we're both looking on purpose at the same thing, and that it's sort of this back and forth thing. I'm just going to read this note. Early in infancy, joint attention usually involves a caregiver pointing or using words to direct an infant's attention. Emerging forms of joint attention occur at about 7 to 8 months, but it's not until about 10 to 11 months that joint attention skills are frequently observed. By the first birthday, infants have begun to direct adults' attention to objects that capture their attention. And this idea that joint attention is like a super important part of kids' ability to learn. Quick extra note, okay? You'll notice that we're a few days behind here. I was supposed to get you the quest assignment last Friday, so I'm gonna probably put the quest assignment out tonight or tomorrow. I'm gonna reuse last year's video about the quest assignment just because it's like a 15-minute video where I basically explain how to do it. And the way I recorded it is I like recorded myself playing the game to show you how to do it, and it's just I gotta put some boundaries on like how many hours I'm putting towards this. I really wanted to get this presentation to you good. I'm gonna get the quiz set up tomorrow, and then I'm gonna have another big presentation for Friday. So and then you guys have like a week off coming up pretty soon we have another week where I have sort of reading, sort of like the social determinants coming up. So like, it feels, maybe just for me, but it feels like super hectic right now. But it won't. I promise. Like we're close to getting, the train on the right track. Okay, that's all I was gonna say. So I'm gonna reuse the quest video just because the return on investments. It's the same effect for you, and I'll have the assignment updated and stuff, and it's the same thing basically. I'm just getting you to play the quest game on the McGraw-Hill website that they have set up, that's designed to get you to like apply some of these ideas. In this university classes, I guess at Nipissing, your classes have like get approved by the Senate, and certain things have to be in the course. So you have to have this like virtual child thing, right? So there's really only two options for it: the McGraw-Hill one or the Pearson one. So I'll do that. Okay, so basically here's the quick rundown. So I guess whoever's on slide 11 of this slide 11, it's hard because it's all split up now, but anyways, I promise I'll make this all clear. I'll catch up. I'll have the quiz out for this chapter soon. I'll have the quest out. I'll have the next chapter out and that quiz out. And remember, all these quizzes you have like until basically, late November to do. So don't eat up my anxiety. Don't please don't become nervous about the class. Like I feel like if we're close to being, in the groove. So I'm just gonna keep working to try to make it happen. Okay, so anyways, blah 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 blah. All right. I like Nipissing students. I said sometimes my kids take forever to get to sleep. I would have loved to start this at like 6 o'clock, but it's like kids are like the best part and the hardest part. And so sometimes you're getting like a more tired and strained version of me than I would, like to present. But like sometimes I try to be at least a bit honest about it, and at least a bit like of a real person. Like I'm just a 43-year-old dad in Kitchener with 2 kids and a wife, and trying to pay the bills and make ends meet and be a decent person and handle my kids' temper tantrums when they come up, and try to be a decent role model and try not to yell at, keep my temper, and try to like not stress out, and try to keep my own head from getting negative, and try to set a decent example for my students, and try to get my stuff. So anyways, I'm just saying, it's like life's complicated, but just try to be a good person and work hard. That's all you can do. And I don't know why I said that. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so like I'm 9:40. What's the health recommendation? Slam a coffee the size of your head, basically. This is funny meme, and it's like what it feels like having like your second kid or whatever, and it's just like just a guy, and he's just like eating spoonfuls of coffee grinds right out of like the coffee can. It's like, oh god, that's so gross, but right. So now, what's implicit and what's explicit? This is actually pretty interesting. You know that memory. What's memory? Memory is that you like if I tell you something and then I ask you later what I told you and you can't remember it, means you can't remember it. You can't put it back together. You don't have a memory of it. So at a certain point, memory is your ability to like, before I was making that whole rant, I remember yesterday about like how memory's stored and stuff. But it's like, so memory is this ability to retain information, or to like basically be able to call on things that you've learned later. And sometimes it's a couple seconds later, and sometimes it's a memory of your childhood that stays with you your whole life. Once a 6-month year, and this is one of the reasons why kids don't remember much from early on in life, is because, the memory's still developing. By about 6 months,
kids tend to be able to show memory recollection of about, a day. Now, this is all like, take this with a grain of salt, because kids are remembering mom, and especially mom's sound and presence, whatever, like the physicalness, almost immediately. So implicit memory. Okay, so explicit memory is not remembering what you had for breakfast yesterday, but implicit memory is remembering that when you're hungry, you come into the kitchen. Right? So the child might remember certain behaviors, almost like memory without conscious recollection, skills, routines, procedures. And an interesting way to talk about this is like the amnesia idea, that like how come somebody that has amnesia and can't form new explicit memories, you could say it like that, or episodic memories is another way of talking about it, like episodes of your life. And it's like, but how come they can still have implicit or sometimes like procedural memory? It's called. It's like, how come they don't forget how to talk? How come they don't forget how to walk? How come they don't forget how to tie their shoes and make a sandwich and make coffee and what coffee is? So it's like some of what we remember is in a story form, in this like explicit. Explicit means like what you see, and implicit means sort of what you don't see, and what's explicit and what's implied or what's implicit. And so like a lot of the baby's memory is implicit. Yeah, and so they call this like infantile amnesia or like childhood amnesia. Now it's kind of a weird use of the term, right? Because usually we think of amnesia as like someone's developed some kind of, oftentimes, like acquired brain injury situation. But everyone knows what you mean by amnesia, that it basically means like forgetting. And see, you start to realize like everything's in your memory, that actually once you start to forget, like, and this is also incredibly relevant for things like Alzheimer's, that so much of like who you are is in your relationships with people, and so much of your relationships with people is in your memory and in their memory. And when you start to lose your memories of the people, you can start to lose the people. So in childhood, this childhood amnesia, or this idea that the prefrontal lobe, like that plays an important part in storing memories of events, is still in an earlier developmental stage, immature, right? Like the actual use of that word, meaning like not at its mature or final stage. At the end of the second year of life, long-term memory is more sustainable, more reliable. It's getting stronger, better. So concepts, this is okay. If you wanted to just have this down, the perceptual categorization, and this is like just a fancy way of saying like toys are toys, and then these things are like daddy's work stuff, and then these things are like my toys, and these things are, if say I'm pretending I'm like my daughter Charlotte now, these are my toys, and these are Evie's toys, and this is daddy's cup, and this is mommy's cup, and these are my boy cousins, and these are my girl cousins, and these are my friends, and these are the people I don't like, and these are the categories. And the categories and concepts are how the baby's brain's forming, basically. Okay, so a concept's basically this idea of like, yeah, that things go together, that like when this happens, and we start to have conceptualizations, or like basically attempts to understand and make sense of our world, our conceptual understanding. That part of that is how we're making sense of it. Oh, that's what this is. That's what concepts are, a key part of it. Like, okay, all these things that are like circles or balls, right? And some of them are soccer balls, and some of them are basketballs, and some of them are tennis balls, and some of them are lacrosse balls, and some of them are whatever, volleyballs. And then there's some things that are like dolls, and some of the dolls are like action figures, and some of them are like girl dolls or whatever, and then some of them are whatever, right? And it's like that categories. So basically the idea is, and you can think about this, like I didn't explain that the greatest, but you're all smart people. What am I really saying? That the brain's basically doing two things. It's trying to explain what it's seeing with early concepts. Concepts just saying basically it's like trying to it's not just, it's starting to move a little bit out of the or the sensory motor stage where it's mainly just experiencing, and it's starting to trying to understand that experience with a conceptual layer. And at the same time, in doing that, the only way to make things not seem like everything's just random is to start being like, okay, well, this is more like this, then it's like this, and this is more like this, then it's like this, and everything starts becoming categories. Sorry, I'm going all wild with my hands, but categories are based on similar perceptual objects. Like there's some things that are small things and some things that are big things, and then there's like small animals, there's big birds and small birds and big fish and sharks, and it's fascinating. It's like how the conceptual interlinked library of the brain of the child is developing and emerging at the same time. Right, so the baby's born into this world, and one of the first things that the baby's going to notice is that the people. Sorry, I got to turn that off. I don't know if that's picking up in the video. If it is, that's probably a brutal. Just the ding of like getting a message or whatever. As soon as the baby's born, they're exposed to the world. In this world that they're exposed to, they're hearing all these sounds, and all these sounds are. They start to realize that there's like patterns to it, and the pattern seems to be associated with certain things, and recognizing that the patterns of certain sounds are associated with certain things is basically just a different way of saying learning language. And they start to realize that there's actually this like form of communication. Right, and that water could actually be like, water. I was just thinking of water, that like water could be like this, right? Like, so here's an interesting thing that like kids can sometimes develop understanding sign language before they can speak. So like my daughter knew that like this was water, and then like this was that she wanted more, and then this was that she was all done. And those are the main ones I can think of right off the top of my head. And that is going to be something I get to in a second, but the idea that like a kid can understand more than they can say. One of the things about language though is once you have especially a language that's based on an alphabet, because what's an alphabet? An alphabet's just having a set of symbols that represent different sounds. A, B, C, D, right? But I don't have to sing the alphabet to you. You understand that letters represent sounds. But it's actually wild that what an alphabet does is it allows you to spell any sound. Right, I could say a word like lasagna, which isn't an English word, and you can spell it in English because you can just sound it out. And now all of a sudden that Italian word is just an English word. You can say that I had lasagna for supper, and it like works perfectly in a sentence. So like there's a when it says infinite generativity, whether or not it's like literally infinite, but what it basically means is that compared to like something like hieroglyphics, or even like Arabic, or like Chinese caricatures, although Chinese characters are pretty close to infinitely generative. But there's this, when you're spelling sounds with an alphabet, you can basically spell anything. An endless number of meaningful sentences using finite words and rules. Yeah, the phonetic alphabet spread by the Phoenicians changed everything, right? Because now all of a sudden, anything that you can say, you can spell. So then if you like, if you ever see something, a Chinese word, like say you see something like kung fu, and you're like, well, And it's written as like kung fu. It's like, well, what is that? Because in China it's kung fu too, but it's like spelt in the character. It's like, well, okay, there's Romanized Chinese and there's Pinyin. There's like kind of two main, and there's another one called like Bates style or something. There's like three styles that I know of that are like ways of trying to spell Chinese sounds with an English alphabet, which is basically what a translation of Chinese to English is. So I know this is like totally death by PowerPoint. This is a very PowerPoint heavy. This isn't just chapter 3 might be one of the heaviest present chapters in some ways, because it's just like such a key developmental period. There's so much going on in this birth of language. It's like actually as soon as the baby's born, like they're trying to vocalize like right away from as soon as the baby comes out of the womb. There's crying, there's cooing or gurgling, there's babbling, there's pointing, and actually like babies that aren't pointing, we worry about that. We worry about if their vision even has an issue. You realize that pointing's incredibly powerful, right? I'll just give you like a really simple example. It's like, what do you mean powerful? Well, my daughter couldn't talk. I'm gonna just go back like maybe 2 years or a year and a half, because she's 3 now. So I have a 3-year-old and an 8-year-old. Evelyn's the older and Charlotte's the younger. And what was I gonna say? Oh yeah, so she could like take my hand and pull me into the kitchen and point at a cup and go like this. And that's basically her telling me she wants a drink. And think of what she had to do there. She had to take the person she's trying to tell it to, me, this talk about joint attention, pull me into the kitchen, point at what she wants, and then do the action. But what that does is all of a sudden now she can base that like that was basically language, right? We could say that that's sign language. That's also like nonverbal language, blah blah blah, whatever. It's message received, right? She got the water. So if you look, okay, there's a bunch of aspects of learning language, right? You have to understand what the words mean. You have to be able to say the word, and then the big issue is this idea of segmentation. Like how segments means like a piece. Like how do you line up all the pieces? How do you segment streams of speech into words? How do you take these sounds and make them into these parts of sounds and make them into sounds? And how do you go from to actually kind of starting to talk? And it seems like what babies are doing is they're like, again, it's so wild if you kind of step back. It's like almost like the human brain is born with this ability to immediately be like analyzing and assessing the sounds that it's hearing and looking for patterns and noticing the similarities in the patterns, and when those patterns seem to replicate, and then it starts to notice that, okay, well, mom tends to say this in this situation when we're here, and that whole thing's like learning language, right? It's not just like literally learning the words. It's learning by being immersed and noticing the patterns by repetitive exposure. And so infants can, in that next point, that infants can understand words before they can say them. And this is this term I was kind of stumbling around talking about a little bit ago, around the difference between receptive vocabulary and spoken vocabulary. And this is the exact reason why a kid can understand sign language and ask to have a glass of water before they can say they want a glass of water. It's because they understand what they want. And so this is the idea that a kid can understand more than they can say. So can you. So can everybody. I can like talk at a certain level, but I can understand other people talking a little bit higher than what I can do. And so can everybody. Even a little kid. This is just kind of an interesting stat. On average, infants understand about 50 words by the time they're a bit over a year. Right, but they're not going to be able to say 50 words until they're about a year and a half. right? So the reason for showing you that is just that's kind of interesting, right? It's almost like a half of a year later before they can actually say it, but they understand it earlier. Okay, so it says here, this is kind of interesting that like most of what a kid learns first of all are nouns, or like early on are nouns, like basically labels, right? And often they'll say, when I say they're like often use the various intentions with a single word, like water could be like any drink. And so, and that sort of makes sense, right? It's generalized and it becomes more specific. Kids tend to have their first word, anywhere from 9 months to a year and a half, and then anywhere from like, a little bit less than a year and a half to a little more than 2 years, they tend to go through the spurt. And the reason those aren't like more specific is because this is like, well, there's just a lot of individual difference. Most kids are talking by almost 2. Most kids are talking pretty good by 3. It's like there's not. My advice to parents would be to like, unless there's like specific concerns, it's like most kids catch up. Most kids by like 2.5 are talking. Okay. Yeah, worrying too much about norms can be unnecessary anxiety. That's one of the more modern ideas in psychology, is that for a long time psychology was probably way too focused on milestones and norms. They're important in terms of like noticing certain things and maybe being on the look for certain kind of visual or auditory problems or even learning disabilities, but like in general there's just so much diversity between individuals that explains most of it, almost always. All right. Yeah, so like, okay, um so I have here this idea that by the time the kid's getting to like a year and a half, 2 years, you're starting to hear more of these like 2 word utterances, like basically putting like drink water or something like that. That'd be a 2 word utterance. But still, the kid's relying a lot on gestures, tones, and context, right? Like daddy, drink. It's like taking advantage of the fact that pulling me into the kitchen, pointing at it, basically using situational cues to. So what my basic point is the kids like using their environment and their body to communicate above the level of their spoken vocabulary. And this seems to happen in basically every language. And almost every language, and I don't know if there's even exceptions, basically every language, children start off with more telegraphic speak, like daddy, ice cream. Daddy, give ice cream. And it's not like, excuse me, Dad. I was wondering if when you have time you could possibly go to the freezer and grab me an ice cream. It's like, ice cream, Daddy, Daddy, ice cream. It's like they're both sort of saying the same thing. One's like much more polite and long-winded and everything, but like Daddy, ice cream, and Daddy, could you please consider going to the fridge to grab me an ice cream? Both are telling me what to do and what you want and how to make you happy, right? It's telegraphic speech. It's very precise. It's like if I was gonna say, I'm gonna hit you, I'm gonna hit you, and then I punch out, it's like I telegraph that punch. It's like they're like using their emotion to kind of show you what they're trying to say. The use of short, precise words without a lot of grammar, such as, yeah, even the example I have here in this note, Daddy, give ice cream. It actually allows the kid, it sounds simple and kind of silly, but it's actually kind of deep because it allows a kid to communicate higher than their vocabulary ability. So this is interesting, right? So if you look at this picture of this little girl's brain, you'll see that the part of your brain that's involved in producing the words that you're going to say, like right now when I'm talking, there's like one part of my brain the workers area that is kind of like focusing on making sense of what I'm saying, and then Broca's area is like actually these are just people's last names that had famous injuries. Is just like suggesting or actually producing the words. So basically, it's like saying, without getting too complicated, that there's one part of your brain that's literally like telling my that's literally producing the words, and there's another part that's sort of thinking about. It's complicated, but it makes sense once you see what happens when one of them gets hurt. So there's a part of your brain that's sort of making sense of things, and then it almost has like this other tool that's like actually firing out the words. And you can have damage to either one, and I'll show you on the next slide. But if you could just have this quick, the Broca's area is the area of the left frontal lobe that is involved in producing words, like literally, like almost like when I'm talking and just like rambling, there's a part of my brain that's like throwing the words out of my mouth basically, and then there's another part that's like trying to understand what all of it means. Then those are different areas, right? Wernicke's area is that part of the left hemisphere that's used in trying to understand what comprehension, understanding, comprehending. One of the interesting things here is like the way you can see is okay, so there can be damage to either parts, right? So when this Broca's area gets damaged, people, and this is very stressful and very frustrating and very anger creating, because people that get injuries here, and most of the time it's from car accidents or really bad fights or really bad falls, um, they'll understand what they're trying to say but not be able to say it. So think about how frustrating that would be if I knew what I was trying to say to you, but I just couldn't get myself to say it. Think how frustrating that would be. Or the Wernicke's area is even worse though, because that's damages, then you don't even know what the words mean, and what is speech if it's unintelligible? It loses its functional power, right? If you don't know the words you're saying, then you're not actually using language, you're just making sound. And I don't know, this idea is like not necessarily aged the best, but it's like it's just an interesting concept. I'd say like you don't get married to it. There's no literal thing called a language acquisition device in the baby's brain. But it's a useful concept, and Chomsky's like a pretty well-known linguist, and he's really interested in how it seems like the baby is born with, to use a computer reference, with like the hardware to learn language. It's not just that a baby can learn language, it's like they're built waiting for that upgrade. Almost like they have almost like they're biologically pre-wired to learn language at a certain time and in a certain way. He thought that children were born into the world with a language acquisition device. They basically had like a part of their brain that they've inherited from their ancestors that allows us to make sense of language, which we do have. Like we totally do have that. It's just not like a extra part of the brain. That's just like a way of talking about how the brain. So again, it's like he's not actually talking about a thing, he's talking about a process. And so it conceptually makes sense. Yeah, and even in the note I have that like Chomsky's idea of his lad idea, the language acquisition device, is a theoretical idea. It's not like actually a part of the brain. But it's like everything you learn about the brain seems like it's designed to speak, or it's designed to. It's almost like it has a language acquisition device built into it. I'll just use the terms on the slide. All right, rapid fire lightning round. I'll just kind of go over some main points because this has been a marathon of a presentation for all of us, and if you've been taking notes through all of this, you're awesome, and I'll try to keep the future ones a bit more concise, I promise. Okay, so number one, most development follows this cephalosaccatal head to tail and proximodistal like middle to or like center to extremity approach. Physical growth is rapid during the first year of life, but starts to slow towards the second year. Dramatic changes in characteristics of the brain development in the first 2 years. The neurons are born, synapses form, they're pruned, major structures of the brain emerge. A neuroconstructive view is increasingly becoming more popular, looking at how the actual construction of the, we use the word connectome or the wiring of the brain happens. We talked about how sleep is related to cognitive development. Number 6, this idea of reflexes being automatic movements that govern behavior, right? And I went on this like long rant about it's kind of wild and interesting to think that you're born with behaviors that you didn't learn, and we call those reflexes. We talked about dynamic systems theory, that motor skills develop when babies are motivated to act. So like the perception and action are coupled. We talked about gross motor skills and fine motor skills. As we continued in our presentation, we talked about, okay, yeah, sensation occurs when information interacts with your sensory receptors, your eyes, your ears, your nose, all that. Perception is the interpretation of that perception. We looked at the idea of visual acuity, depth perception, talked about intermodal perception. Remember, I'm kind of reviewing stuff that would be useful to know for the test. We're talking about how nature and nurture interact in this kind of perception development. Number 14. In Piaget's theory, children can construct their own cognitive worlds. Right? And we talked about like accommodation, assimilation. Piaget argued that babies don't really understand object permanence before about 8 to 9 months, although recent research is suggesting that object permanence is a thing, but it might be some babies are demonstrating a kind of demonstratable object permanence a bit earlier. Social cognitive development, or social cognition, or this ability to think in terms of social situations. Social cognition is like an interesting term that we'll get a lot more into in this course, but what does it mean to have cognitions that are sort of aware, or cognitions or thoughts that are sort of aware of your social situation, and that even is developing towards the end of infancy. Hey, we did it. Everyone survived. Wasn't that bad, was it? It was only like, what, 5 different recording sessions. Yeah, we warriored that one out. I'll try to be a little more I've said this like 100 times this presentation, but stick with me. We'll catch up. We'll get it. Stick with me, and I'll stick with you. You'll see that when, I don't know, if you know people that have been in my course before, it's like, I sometimes bite off more than I can chew and get behind, but things will work out. They always do. All right? And be a good person, work hard, keep your stick on the ice, reach out if you need anything, and I'll talk to you soon.